SomaFM presents the SF and SF podcast for May 2016. Recorded live at the American Bookbinders Museum, SF and SF is Science Fiction in San Francisco, a monthly series of author readings from the science fiction, fantasy, horror, and genre literary fields, hosted by Terry Bisson. And now, the coordinator of SF and SF, Rina Weisman.
Well, welcome everyone. I am Rina Weisman with SF and SF, Science Fiction in San Francisco. We occasionally stretch the boundaries to include fantasy, mystery, genre, anything that's actually interesting to me. So I figure if it's interesting to me, it's interesting to a few other people. So off we go with it. I'd like to welcome you again tonight. It is a beautiful evening out, so I appreciate you all being here tonight to share with our authors, M. Thomas Gammarino and Marie Brennan. It's really appreciated. And you are at this lovely venue, the American Bookbinders Museum at 355 Clementina here in San Francisco, one of SF's newest museums, and definitely worth a visit when it's not filled with chairs and authors, just for the fabulous, fabulous antique machinery alone that all still works. And before I go any farther, I wanted to introduce you to Madeline Robbins, who will tell you just a little bit about this wonderful place that we find ourselves at. Madeline?
Good evening. The American Bookbinders Museum is the sort of passion project of a guy named Tim James, who was a binder for 25 years. And in the course of doing his work, he collected these machines. He started collecting books and ephemera. And eventually, this museum is what happened. We give tours Tuesday through Saturday at 10, 1, and 3. We also have a bunch of different kinds of programs that we are working on, including I hope soon to start, tour for kids, the Apprentice Tour. But really, what is fun about this place is that it makes you look at books in a whole different way, from hand-bound books from the Renaissance to books from the Victorian era. We're looking at bookbinders and books, and as a crowd like this should be kind of interested in stuff like that. So please come and see sometime, and welcome to the Bookbinders Museum.
Thank you, Madeline. Just a little housekeeping here. SF and SF is very pleased to be here at the Bookbinders Museum. I cannot mention that name enough. Through the end of the year, so to let you know some of the events we have coming up. Next month, June 12th, we have Rudy Rucker and Michael Blumlein, two very well-regarded local authors you won't want to miss. They're good friends and like to joke around, so it should be a very entertaining evening. July, we'll be hosting Richard Cadre and Thomas Oldevelt. I know I'm mispronouncing his name. I apologize. Yes, that was a question from the audience. Yes, he will be here. A lot of authors sometimes do our event in July on their way back from Comic-Con in San Diego, so we are very happy to jump on that bandwagon. And then we just finalized an event for August, Sunday, August 14th, with David D. Levine and his Arabella of Mars, which you won't want to miss. It is a hoot and a fabulous, fabulous fun book. And as well, YA author Cecil Castellucci, and we're holding out the promise of Ben Laurie, so it's going to be a trifecta, which is very unusual for us, but very entertaining nonetheless. Then September, our big guest is Robert Silverberg and his, I guess, co-writer for a book of conversations with Silverberg, Alvaro Zimos Amaro. I think I got it right. I should look these things up, I know. But we're very excited about that in September. And then we'll have a few more things for October and November. We're still finalizing. And then in December, we're going to, very unusually for us, do an event with Kevin Wishnia and PM Press for a fabulous little book called Jewish Noir, which is part of the noir series that have hopped all over the country and genre and places. And this one, I've read it. It's really fabulous. So you want to put that on your calendars at some point, too. For movies, we're still in the deciding stages with the Balboa Theater, what we're offering up next month. I do know we will be doing a special sneak preview of Suicide Squad next month. And if you're on our newsletter, which you can sign up for at our website, just go to sfnsf.org, left-hand sidebar, and you can just sign up, and we don't abuse your email for anything except filling your ear full of the wonderful things that we are in contact with for science fiction and fantasy in the Bay Area. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the evening over and abdicate responsibility for it all by introducing our moderator, Terry Bisson. Thank you.
I want to remind everybody to turn on your cell phones in case something better comes along. And let's begin. We have some interesting writers and thinkers tonight. More writers than thinkers. But our first reader tonight is a fairly new he's not real deep in the science fiction and fantasy field, although I think he's making an entrance with his new book. He's done a couple of novels. He's here from Hawaii, not from the East and not from the West here. He's written some short fiction. His short fiction has mainly been published in the usual SF trades like New York Tyrant, Tin Fish, and Word Riot. And he is the winner of the Elliot Cades Award for Literature, which is a Hawaiian. Was that for this book or for the?
It's sort of in aggregate. It's for the career.
Okay. Yeah. So with no further ado, allow me to introduce M. Thomas Gammarino.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. This is a great honor for me to be sitting next to this guy and having a conversation with him. I was just telling him over dinner that I've introduced 600 high school students to one of his short stories over the past few years. I never expected I'd be, talking to him this way.
I hope I don't have to meet him.
The students? Oh, they'd like you very much, and vice versa. One of them's here. Max, you're out there somewhere. Yeah, he was my science fiction student last year. So this is my new novel, King of the Worlds. Came out about a month ago. I like to think of it as literary science fiction in the sort of absurdist vein. I need to set you up a little bit here, and it's complicated, but let me tell you that this is set somewhere in the multiverse. An easy way to think about it for now is as a kind of alternate history of the last, say, 30, 35 years of American history. An alternate history generally takes one point of departure. So most commonly we see, what if Hitler were killed in his crib or got into art school? How would the 20th century have played out? Or what if the South won the Civil War is one that you see a lot. I've taken made some smaller adjustments to history, smaller tweaks. Like, what if E.T. had a sequel? It's E.T. 2, subtitled Nocturnal Fears. And the star of that film is one Dylan Greenyears, the hero of this, the anti-hero of this book. He plays Jesus in Jesus Christ Superstar in high school. From there, he goes on to be an extra in 12 Monkeys. And next thing you know, he's in line with Terry Gilliam to get a donut in the catering line. And Gilliam says, you know what? I'm doing this sequel to E.T., and you're just the face I've had in mind. You are going to be the adolescent Elliot. And in fact, it's rather off-color sequel. Elliot loses his virginity to an alien. And defying all expectations, it's a huge blockbuster success, this film. So the fan mail starts pouring in, and so do the scripts from his agent. And the first one that he accepts is for a little film called Titanic, directed by James Cameron. And he's cast as the lead role, only when he gets to that now iconic I am the king of the world scene, he just can't pull it off. He just doesn't have the right conviction somehow. And James Cameron grows red in the face and very publicly ejects Greenyears from his film. Says, somebody get me DiCaprio. Now, another of my tweaks is that in 1980, when Carl Sagan's Cosmos aired, the American public was so galvanized by it that NASA immediately began getting 60% of the federal budget. So that by the middle 90s, we're settling exoplanets. I think it's been 70 some of them by this point. It so happens a planet called New Taiwan, 2001 light years away, is looking for a drama teacher. And so when he retreats from Hollywood, he retreats to a distance of some 2001 light years. The novel opens 20 years later, sort of midlife crisis time. He hasn't done a whole lot with himself in the past 20 years, and he's going through a box of old fan mail and sort of gets sucked into this quest to recapture the past. So he begins by finally replying to these letters from teeny boppers of 20 years ago. So they're now in their 30s, they have careers and families and whatnot, but he's finally writing back saying like, hey, I'm still here, you still want to have lunch? So this is the first of those adventures that he has. He teleports back to Earth to meet someone named Ashley Eisenberg in the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. And I'll just jump in. I'll occasionally interrupt myself to dump some info on you. He hopped on a bus to Baltimore. Like most of the rest of the vehicles on the roads here, since fossil fuels were outlawed in 2004, it was powered by natural gas, but it was still wheel-based. How odd to think a civilization that could perfect quantum travel had made so little progress when it came to the daily commute. Going back 10 centuries, personal transport vehicles on New Taiwan had harnessed the planet's natural magnetic field to hover several inches above the ground. The primary fuel was inertia, and good old Lem, that's the name of their son, named after Polish science fiction writer Stanislaw Lem, whom you're familiar with. Good old Lem took care of the rest. Liquid methane was abundant on New Taiwan, and they hardly even used it. Even the rolling road in New Taipei, a multi-lane, i.e. multi-speed, 60-kilometer pedestrian conveyor belt, complete with on-road cafes and rest areas, was wholly magnet-powered. All this tire-to-road friction here on Earth seemed like such a waste, not to mention the source of some highly avoidable nausea. To think you could hardly read on a Terran bus without losing your lunch. He got off at the Inner Harbor. Ashley had told him to meet her at Ye Old Telephone Booth, which she informed him was the last phone booth on the eastern seaboard and listed on all the crossroads signs around the harbor. Along the way, Dylan marveled at the queerness of being surrounded, seemingly entirely, by members of the same species again. It came as something of a relief, in fact, when he spotted the double-jointed knees of a new Taiwanese teenager. That's something you need to know. In all these worlds where we're finding life, it's uncannily like us. And there's a lot of speculation in the book about why that should be so. But it remains a bit of an ambiguity or mystery. But they have weird joints. That's how you can tell them. There's double joints. Double-jointed knees of a new Taiwanese teenager grinding a handrail on his skateboard. Zalbunya, Dylan said, in what he took to be the boy's native tongue. And in reply, he received a wholly unaccented and slightly surly, dude, I was born here, okay? Man, Dylan had been gone a long time. And as if to corroborate this, no one had recognized him as a famous actor yet. He had to remind himself that this was what he supposedly wanted. True to its name, give or take, Ye Old Telephone Booth was just an ordinary phone booth of the sort Dylan remembered so well from childhood. Grayish and with a baby blue border around the top and white letters spelling out telephone. It was cordoned off so that you couldn't get too close, but hordes of earthlings were gathered around taking pictures. Parents waxed nostalgic while their children, who clearly didn't get what this upright coffin thing was supposed to be, tugged at their pants and pled, "Come on, let's go." These kids, like his students and his own offspring, thought of all manner of the old communication devices the way he thought of gas lamps, chamber pots, and horse-drawn carriages as a kid. Charming maybe, but backwards. Now, there's a sidebar to communication devices. There are a number of these throughout the book. They're printed in a different type. And there's a meta aspect to this that I can't quite reveal, or it's too much of a spoiler. Suffice it to say, these are not my info dumps so much as emanating from a consciousness within the book somewhere. But so I'm going to read it very quickly, the info dump for, it's a book about information for communication devices. Practically every sentient being in the known galaxy was plugged into an Omni now, and even those few Luddites who weren't, the Amish, for instance, and the purplish-green civilization on Tupac. I need to explain that too. They're naming these planets in the mid-1990s. They've used up mythology, so they're drawing on pop culture. We have planets like Atlantis, Radiohead, Infinite Jest, Train Spotting, and of course Tupac. were accounted for by it. Dylan remembered that for a time there on Earth, the number of screens per home had proliferated like a cancer. People had their TVs, computers, phones, e-readers, cameras, video cameras, biometric devices, telescopes, translators. It was only a matter of time before a sort of technological gravity and common sense made them converge into a singularity. Dylan, like many members of his generation, still preferred the Omni 7 smart contact lens and wireless earbud rig. But most of his students these days had the more immersive cortical implants, which were a double-edged sword in the classroom. In theory, he could and did limit student access to the Omniverse, but they always found workarounds. Some of their parents conducted their marriages between planets or moons for years at a time via Omni, which relayed bits of communication via entanglement, just as the teleporters relayed bits of biochemistry. Information is information is information. For a monthly fee, the Omni would even project full-blown holograms, and theoretically, though it was at present outlawed by the Mons Olympus Accord on the Reproductive and Reduplicative Rights of Human Persons, 2005, you could even impregnate someone via Omni if you had the right matter printer on the other end. Those given to slippery slope arguments believed the next logical step would be for hominids to forgo external reality altogether and live permanently in the sorts of virtual reality game worlds that had become so popular in the past decade. Naturally, some were doing this already, spending the entirety of their lives in the shadows of the Omniverse, shooting virtual junk into their virtual arms and zipping around on light cycles or wrecking on the half-pipe without any real pain. You still had to surface to eat non-virtual food, however, and the daily reminder that you were spending the majority of your life inside Plato's cave was enough to undermine the pleasure for most people. Dylan himself had experimented with VR as a form of holiday escapism. He'd tried the drugs and slept with the succubae, and they had brought him great audio-visual stimulation, to be sure. But consciousness is a layered thing. And throughout all his virtual amusements, there was always some nagging awareness, one hierarchical level up, that none of it was, quote, real. And the reward centers of the brain, responsible for secreting the dopamine and whatnot, really did seem to care whether you had earned their rewards in the real world or not. Some of the more affluent junkies, with the assistance of months-long IV drips and waste-disintegrating diapers, had taken to having their avatars don virtual VR rigs, and then to have those avatars don virtual VR rigs, etc., in an effort to confuse the cortex into believing that some level or other of this intracranial utopia was real. For Dylan, at least, VR amounted to mere rehearsal for life. It was like reading literature that way, but not half as artful. Whenever he surfaced from a session of VR, he felt vaguely sick and needed a nap to undo the psychic pollution, whereas a good book, especially one printed on a felled tree, made him feel nourished and awake and alive. End of sidebar. Dylan Green years? Dylan looked up. Brown hair, pale, freckled skin, single-jointed knees, too. Human. Very. Ashley Eisenberg? I can't believe I'm finally meeting you, she said. Her teeth gleamed preternaturally white. The pleasure's all mine, he said. She was pretty, if not at all what he'd expected. Eisenberg sounded so Jewish, but this girl looked as Irish as any Molly, or, as it were, Erin. That's his wife's name. Her eyes, like his, were as emerald as any sea. You've hardly changed, she said. That shows what you know. Halter top, muscular arms, breasts like overripe fruit. You hungry? She asked. A bit, yes. Crab cakes sound okay. Miraculous. I haven't had one of those in 20 years. We don't have crabs where I'm living now. There are various types of shellfish, but the meat is different, more sausagey. Ugh. It's not too bad, actually, just different. Speaking of which, where are you living now? Omni doesn't list an address for you. Obviously, he was a celebrity after all, even if no one had done a double take yet today, let alone stop to ask for his autograph. It was normal for celebrities to opt out of Omni's registry. Their existence would be noted, but not their address. As it happened, Dylan's address actually was listed, but it was under his newer, abridged name. Since moving, he's gone by Dylan Green, which is why the subtitle of this novel is The Lost Years of Dylan Green. He had told very few people of his whereabouts after his flight from Earth, and though he considered coming clean with Ashley now, he deemed it too much of a risk. He didn't know her yet, really, and the line between avid fan and stalker he'd heard could be quite thin. Granted, it was he who'd contacted her this time, and not the other way around. Ask me again later, would you? She shrugged. He let her lead the way in her black leather pants, beveled thighs, butt like a heart mark, fuck me shoes. Not that he was thinking about that. They boarded a water taxi and passed through a flotilla of couples and kids pedaling around the harbor in green dragon-shaped boats. Ducks quacked. Dylan found himself choked up all of a sudden by the cerulean sky, which was just so unmistakably earthly. Atmospheric plankton on New Taiwan lent the sky an aquamarine tinge. He had at last come home, or nearly. He's from Philadelphia. Technically, he'd been to Baltimore just once before. His whole family had driven down to visit the National Aquarium when he was a kid. And what he remembered most from that visit, more than the shark walk or the tropical rainforest even, was the giant Pacific octopus, with its undulating tentacles and countless suckers, its quicksilver camouflage, its slit eyes that betrayed some calculating but inscrutable intelligence. Despite all the alien worlds that had been discovered in the years since, it struck Dylan now that Earth's giant Pacific octopus remained in some archetypal way the most alien creature he'd ever seen. They debarked at what Ashley told him was the best restaurant in town and got a seat al fresco right by the water's edge. At her suggestion, they ordered some beers from a local brewery called Flying Dog. "This is pretty surreal," Ashley said. "Having lunch with Dylan Greenyears, I never thought I'd see the day." "It is pretty uncanny. Actually, I used to fantasize that we'd get married someday, but I guess at some point I gave you up for lost." They proceeded to make all sorts of small talk, though it was not so small for her, presumably. And really it wasn't so small for him either, given what it was doing to his ego. He was also learning quite a lot. As a rule, he paid no attention to Terran affairs anymore, so every topical or pop culture reference she made was lost on him. And she made enough of them that he had the defamiliarizing pleasure of hearing his own first language in what amounted to a foreign dialect. Still, he managed to glean a good bit of propositional content too. He learned, for instance, that her bedroom as a girl had been bedecked with posters of him that she'd torn out of Teen Beat and 17, and that she still had every word of Nocturnal Fears memorized. He learned that these days she worked as a certified public accountant, that she did triathlons, that she was married to a cop and had 3 kids. When she asked what he did with himself these days, he replied, a little ashamedly, teaching mostly. Teaching acting, among other things. I see. She nodded, as if impressed, though he was quite sure she wasn't. On the bright side, the beer was good, and the crab cakes were spectacular, plump with imperial meat, lightly breaded and seasoned with Old Bay. The fries were excellent, too. The coleslaw was neither here nor there. "So I hope you don't mind if I ask the million-quid question," Ashley said. "Does it have anything to do with a movie about a sinking boat?" "Yes." "I guess I'd prefer if you didn't ask it then." "Okay, all right, I get that." He hadn't meant to sound so brusque. He had hoped it wouldn't come up, though he'd been fairly certain it would. At least he'd nipped it in the bud, though an awkward lull followed. They finished their beers and studied the seagulls in silence, not bothering to look at each other until the waiter came to ask if they were interested in dessert. "I think we'll be leaving, actually," Ashley said. "The check, then?" "Please." Mercifully, a plane was flying by overhead, trailing an advertising banner that read, "Cancer cells have rights too." It gave them something to look at. When the check finally arrived, Dylan took it and rifled through his wallet for cash. He hadn't used Terran money in years, and he'd never used the Terran quid, so it took him quite a long time to pay. Leave it to James Cameron to turn this into a disaster, too. Dylan had come 2001 light years, allowed a previous copy of himself to be murdered, lied unabashedly to his wife, and all for what? Crab cakes? What a sentimental fool he'd been to think anything redemptive might come of this. "Can I leave the tip?" Ashley asked. "It was generous enough of you to meet me," Dylan said. "So let's be honest," Ashley said. "That was by all accounts a pretty terrible meal. Not the food. The food was good, but you and I just did not hit it off at all. Am I right?" "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have contacted you." "That's not what I'm driving at," she said. "I'm glad you did." This took him by surprise. "Look," she went on, "here's my situation, and I'm just going to lay all my cards on the table because I literally don't have time for subtlety. Basically, I've got 3 hours before I have to pick up my kids from gymnastics." She pulled a tube of Mentos out of her purse and slipped one of them into her mouth. "I understand," he said. "I won't waste another minute of your time. And I happen to know an expensive little hotel around the way." Dylan suffered the psychic equivalent of whiplash. "What? You want to go to a hotel?" "Well, I don't particularly, but my inner teenager would never forgive me if I didn't, and unless my 30-year study of human nature is totally off base, I'm pretty sure you're on board, Min?" "To be honest, I hadn't really thought that far ahead," he said. "So think now." He took a Mento, popped it in his mouth, and thought. It was strange, but while he was very clearly cheating on Erin in some way already, He had not explicitly conceived of this escapade in sexual terms until now, not explicitly. Had the accountant turned out to be the better reader of human nature than the master of literature? His tinnitus keened. His brain was dying. Amanda Cruz, one of his students, thought he was 60. He's just turned 40. Okay, he thought about it. Let's go, he said. She smiled, took his hand, and led him around the way. They didn't waste another second of each other's lives on conversation. Ashley was right at that age where the body is shouting, procreate, one more time, now or never. And so she was absolutely ravenous in bed. He had never been on the receiving end of so much meaningless, pure aggression before. She dug her nails into his back, moaned, talked dirty, slurped the dripping sweat from his neck, and intermittently possessed by some demon, locked her legs around his waist and bucked so wild and out of control that he worried his dick would break. And what kind of excuse was he going to give Erin about that? Nonetheless, indeed all the more, it was the best sex he'd ever had in his life. What it was not, however, was transcendent. It didn't make him young again, or hopeful, or free. It didn't take him back to the moon or the silver screen. No, as they rutted around that afternoon, Dylan never once escaped that moderately priced hotel room, the sweaty bag of his skin, the unidirectional arrow of time, and all the accumulated headweight of history and circumstance. And even as Ashley whispered in his ear, "Fuck me, Dylan Green Years, like it's the last thing you'll ever do," he found himself wondering just who she believed she was fucking anyway. Did she really think he was the same person whose glossy photos used to hang on the wall of her bedroom, who'd acted in those films? He had certain memories in common with that younger man, sure, though his way of thinking about them, his orientation toward them, had changed beyond recognition, as had his wealth and social status. Even without teleportation, every cell in his body would have replaced itself many times over since he'd been a star. What of that star remained then? Only brute biological patterns, the way his DNA instructed his body to assemble proteins, so that he still bore some resemblance to the hominid she'd once fantasized about marrying someday, and even those patterns were subject to change over time. All of that was equally true of her, too, of course. This athletic 30-something adulteress presently seated athwart his chin was by no means the same Teen Beat subscriber who'd once chaired the Dylan Green Years fan club at her high school. They were the both of them imposters. Still, it was nice. As soon as she'd swallowed his cum, Dylan asked, "Hadn't you better get going?" She looked at the clock. 6 minutes ago. Then she sprang up and began getting dressed. "Any chance you're free again tomorrow?" he asked. "Or this evening, for that matter?" "Oh," she said. And she cut the pace of getting into her shirt by half. "What?" "I thought we might be on the same page about this." "What page is that?" Dylan asked. "The one where this is a one-time deal? The one where I don't think we should see each other again?" "I see. I was definitely on a really different page." "Dylan, look, I enjoyed being with you this afternoon. Once we stopped attempting to communicate, it was really wonderful. I got to live out a fantasy. This will sound weird, but I felt like I was surfing on the back of a dolphin." "Come again?" "Surfing on a dolphin. I've wanted to do that ever since I saw some guy do it at the aquarium when I was a little girl. It seems so magical. And yet I have no doubt in my mind that those people who get to do that for a living curse the fact that they have to surf on dolphins day in and day out. It's the law of diminishing returns. I see it all the time in my job. You should see someone bank $1 million for the 100th time. It's like they barely notice. They grunt. I don't want to be like that. Besides, Dylan, I have a family, and while you've told me practically nothing about you, I'd say there's a pretty good chance you do too, no? Doing this once was innocent enough, but repeat it and we start hurting people, do we not? Not least of all ourselves?" Dylan nodded. She was right, of course. Okay then, she was dressed now. He was still naked, and now he felt it. He covered his soggy genitals with the sheet. She sat down on the edge of the bed. "Thank you, Dylan Green Years." "For what?" "For giving an awkward teenage girl an outlet for her feelings, for being my first crush, and in a way, my first broken heart." "Well, that was all in your head," he said. "And just like I was in yours," she parried. Well, she had a point. She slipped into her heels, leant over the bed, and kissed him gently on the lips one last time. Then she went off to pick up her kids. Fantastic. Now he had a weekend to hang out in Baltimore. Just what he'd never wanted. Within the hour, Dylan was at the Greyhound station boarding another bus, this time to Philadelphia. Since leaving Earth, he'd kept in touch with his parents on a regular basis via Omni, but he hadn't returned in the flesh even once, and while he couldn't very well visit them now either, since word would sooner or later get back to Erin, who talked to his mother more than he did, he figured he could at least spy on them a bit and make sure they were doing okay. Do I have time for a couple more paragraphs? There's a nice break there. For the duration of the nauseating bus ride, Dylan stared out the tinted window and reacquainted himself with his homeworld. If he squinted a little, I-95 was every bit the wide, soulless highway it had always been. But upon closer inspection, it was clear the world had changed. Countless bumper stickers shrieked, "Earth, love it or leave it." And the infrastructure, accordingly, looked surprisingly good. No bumps or potholes marred the road, and bridges and overpasses appeared secure where not altogether new. Holographic signboards every few miles reminded drivers to carpool because though CO2 emissions were no longer an issue, natural gas was itself a non-renewable resource, an automotive stopgap while the industry perfected the solar fuel cell. Still, where Earthlings might have taken pride in finally being responsible stewards of their planet, there was instead a sense of defeat in the air, as if the discovery of other advanced civilizations in the galaxy had served as yet another indignity in a long line of them since Galileo informed humans that the cosmos didn't revolve around them, and Darwin that they were less angels than apes. Society appeared to be functioning better than ever, but there was a palpable lack of ambition and creativity in the air. In its place was a whiff of surrender and pragmatism that Dylan found at once tragic and impressive. America was at last becoming life-sized. Even the religious, the ones with a fish or crescents or stars on their bumpers, appeared defeated, underzealous, with the possible exception of a pair of shirt and tie wearing Mormons who biked by on pedestrian bridge looking jaunty as ever. He disembarked at the Greyhound station in Philly, that symbolic city, and went for a walk past City Hall, which looked just as it had when he and Chad used to come downtown high on youth and dreams to knock on the door of their sex-drenched futures. Atop the tower, William Penn stood sentinel still, keeping watch over the old Capitol from what had once been the tallest building in the world. How many patriots had charted their disillusion by that piss-yellow clock? Dylan walked and thought and maybe cried a little, and soon he was tripping over the cobblestones of Old City where 2.5 centuries since the great experiment had begun. Oh, the beautiful, childlike hubris of it. His heart told and cracked. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Our next reader is a familiar field in science fiction and mostly fantasy, and also has a, I would say, a presence as a critic and someone who examines the crafts of writing fiction and writing long fiction and even longer fiction. And that's what I say. She's also a photographer and a short story writer. She's been published in Tor.com, in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, in Strange Horizons. Since she broke into the field, or landed in the field some 12 or 13 years ago, she's written a dozen books, some 40 short stories, and has done a lot of, I don't know, well, we'll talk about it later, but a lot of work in sort of deconstructing the way fantasy is written, and has some interesting things to say about that. Her Lady Trent series has several books in it. Her latest is In the Labyrinth of Drakes, and she's here tonight to read from it. And this is Marie Brennan.
Well, thank you all for coming. I was here once before, I think a few years ago, but it's a pleasure to be back. I'm going to contradict you slightly in that I will not be reading from In the Labyrinth of Drakes. Normally what I try to do is read from the next book in the series, because you guys have gone to the effort of coming out here tonight. It's nice to give you something that is not available on the shelves right now to everybody else. However, as those of you who are at my Borderlands event will have heard me say, that doesn't work this time around. When I was writing the 5th book, I had a scene that I thought, this will be the scene that I will read when I'm on tour. It was going to be my spoiler-free scene. By the time I was done revising the book, it was no longer spoiler-free. So I read at Borderlands a short story in the Lady Trent setting, but I decided that tonight, since some of you have already heard that, I would read something different, which is a selection from a novella that's coming out this fall. I believe it's scheduled for September. It's coming out from Tor.com's new novella line. The title of it is Cold Forged Flame. And this is a little bit of a shift from the memoirs because, as those of you who have read the memoirs of Lady Trent know, the series is very, very low fantasy. In fact, in many ways, it's more science fictional than it is fantastic because the main character is a scientist. She may be studying dragons, but they're natural animals. With these novellas that I'm going to be doing with Tor.com, I wanted to get back to some of the more mythical sides of fantasy because part of my background is in anthropology and the other half is in folklore. Kind of wanted to get to the folklore a bit more. So this is going to be a little bit from a certain distance into the novella. So for background here, the way that it opens is that the main character is summoned out of some other realm of existence by a group of people who, the minute that she lands in their midst, they magically bind her to perform a certain task for them. So she's actually compelled to carry this out. And she doesn't really know. They've told her she needs to get blood from the cauldron of the Leon. She has no idea what the Leon is, why they need this blood. In fact, she doesn't know anything at all. I have, for the first time in my life, committed amnesiac protagonist, which partway through writing the novella, I'm sitting there going, what am I doing? I'm writing an amnesiac protagonist alone on a deserted island, but it worked out. And in fact, she keeps being told that she shouldn't try to remember things because she is safer if she doesn't remember, which is annoying the snot out of her because that's a really obnoxious thing to be told. Anyway, she's been told that she needs to go do this thing for them. She is magically compelled to follow through, and she's just been rowed across a bay to an island that pretty much looks like it wasn't there a moment before, so clearly not an ordinary place. And with some farewell words has been basically dumped over the side to get on with it. By the time she makes it to shore, Theriad is already a vague shadow in the distance, the sound of his oars muffled by the fog. It occurs to her, far too late, to wonder how she's supposed to get off the island once she obtains this blood they've sent her for. That unanswered question doesn't bother her as much as it should. Even though she knows she's been forced into this, even though she figures she's going to die, she's in a better mood than she was at first. It's obscurely satisfying, knowing there's a mountain somewhere with a cave, a cauldron in that cave, blood in that cauldron, and she will find them. Her feet are itching to get started. And itching in a literal sense from the salt water and grit. She finds a stone big enough to sit on and takes off her boots, letting her feet dry while she takes a look around. There isn't much to see yet, not with the light still so dim. On one side, water and mist, on the other, cliffs. In between lies this rocky beach. Rivulets of water trail off the cliffs in various spots, which prove to be fresh when she tastes them. She uses them to rinse the salt from her skin, washing out the inside of her boots. The leather will be wet for a long time, but there's no helping that. She hasn't paid much attention to her own clothing before now. It's simple stuff, black boots, black breeches made of sturdy canvas, and a black shirt without sleeves or collar. Nothing like what the Crucious people wore, with their tunics and drapes of brightly patterned wool. She doesn't think they put these clothes on her. The fabric feels well-worn and comfortable, the boots already shaped to her feet. Which means, what? That she had them before? Whenever before was. The stones of the beach are sharp enough under her feet that she puts the boots back on, even though they're still damp, and begins her search. The cliffs, she thinks, can be climbed, but it won't be easy, and she doesn't much relish the thought of shredding her hands on them. She heads off in a clockwise direction, looking for a gully or the end of the cliffs, some place where they give way to easier terrain. She walks for long enough to draw two conclusions. First, while the sun may be rising somewhere, it isn't here, and may never be. And second, there is no end to the cliffs. You knew it wouldn't be easy, she mutters to herself, giving the cliffs a baleful look. She isn't positive she's made a full circuit of the island yet because she didn't think to mark her starting point, assuming that would have done any good. But she's seen enough to be pretty sure there's no point in continuing to search. It's the cliffs or nothing. They're going to tear her hands bloody if she doesn't find some way to protect herself. She contemplates her shirt, then shakes her head. Wrapping her hands in that would require her to find or break a rock to cut with, and enough fabric to really protect her hands would leave her without much of a shirt to wear. The only other thing out here is seaweed. Fortunately, there's plenty of that, and it comes in convenient strips. She finds some above the current water line, still wet enough to be supple. Nothing here is dry, really, but not too slick. It tastes of brine when she uses her teeth to pull the knots closed. She eyes the wrappings dubiously, curling her hands into experimental fists. The seaweed will play merry hell with her grip. But she doesn't have anything better, and so she approaches the cliff and looks for her first handhold. She's barely off the ground when she decides the wrappings were a terrible idea. She couldn't pull the strips tight enough to keep them from sliding, and now they shift every time her weight moves. When she grips harder to compensate, the stone cuts into the soft mass, and pretty soon she's got bits of seaweed dangling from her palms like thick, salty hair. She tries to sweep them under her hand the next time she reaches for a hold, just to get as much use out of the padding as she can before it's reduced to mere decoration. That turns out to be a mistake. Her grip fails, and she falls. The good news is that she hasn't gotten very high. The bad news is that she's high enough for landing to hurt. The stones of the beach roll out from under her feet as she hits, dumping her onto her ass. She bites her tongue when her head snaps back and tastes a hint of blood. Once she's got her breath back, she spits to one side and tears what remains of the seaweed off her hands. Fuck, that went even worse than you expected. Her fall teaches her one thing at least. The Kurish's command may drive her onward, but it doesn't protect her from failure. If she makes a bad decision, gets herself killed, that binding will not save her. It's anger as much as the compulsion that sends her back to her feet. Wiping her hands on her shirt, she glares at the cliff. Let's try this again. This time the going isn't that bad at first. The mist and rivulets of water render the stone slippery, but without the seaweed making things worse, she can cope. The cliff face is broken enough to provide her with a variety of handholds. She moves crabwise up a diagonal, following a striation in the rock. But the jagged stones that provide her with edges to grip also tear at her skin just like she imagined, no matter how carefully she settles her fingers. Her feet can't take as much of her weight as she'd like. The boots are clumsy, and if she descends and takes those off, she'll be walking on bleeding feet the rest of the way. She'd rather sacrifice her hands. The last few lengths are the worst, because by then her grip is slick with blood. One failure and she'll fall again, this time from a much higher point. She laughs bitterly at a tiny fern growing in front of her eyes. If I'm gonna fall, then I damn well hope I'm high enough to die when I hit the ground. None of this bullshit about lying there with broken legs until I die of exposure. The fern doesn't respond. She clenches her teeth and climbs on until she reaches the top. Up there, the ground is smooth and padded with moss. She rolls onto her back, breathing hard, every muscle in her body going limp. Her hands ache steadily, pain radiating up her arms. The moss might work as a bandage if she tears thin strips off her shirt to bind the pads in place. She didn't think to bring a rock to cut the fabric, though. When she has her breath back, she sits up and finds that where her hands had been, the moss is now red with blood. Genuinely red. The sky above her is clear, the moon's crescent sliver near the horizon. The wrong horizon, she thinks. But even in that monochrome light, the stain is vivid with color. And when she touches it, the stain comes up in her fingers, a long strip of red cloth. She stares at it, unblinking. The fabric is long and thin and not raw. Someone has stitched it into a sash. It wasn't there when she collapsed. A swift glance around reveals no one. Not that anybody could have put that under her hands without her noticing, but she has to look anyway. The sensible thing to do would be to take a stone from the top of the cliffs and use it to cut the sash up for bandages. There are two problems with that, though. The first is that the cliffs are gone. To her left, the ground now descends in an easy series of moss-covered boulders to the shore not far below. The second is that she doesn't want to destroy her sash. She catches herself thinking of it that way, not the sash, but her sash, which she supposes is only fair. If this is what her blood turned into, then it belongs to her. She rises to her feet, still holding the fabric in her bloody hands. The feeling of lightning is back, dancing along her veins. Without ever making a conscious decision, she finds herself tying the sash around her waist, leaving the ends to hang free. Her hands form the knot as if they've done this before countless times, and for a moment, there's a flicker, an ephemeral breath of memory, a sense that this is how she always dresses, except it's incomplete. She feels the absence of long sleeves, leather cuffs around her wrists, a weight at her hip. Her breath comes faster. It's safer if you don't remember. So Therdiad claims in the Kruish. But can she believe them? It's too late now regardless, the flicker is gone. All she knows is that the sash feels right, as much as anything can feel right on this island, where cliffs vanish while her back is turned and the moon will never set. She's beginning to understand why only one of the Kurish's people survived.
What's the title of this?
Cold Forged Flame.
Cold
Forged Flame. Like
Cold
camera.
Forged Flame. All right, let's take 7.5 minutes, get a drink of whiskey, a beer, a wine, and then everyone must return. We're going to have a discussion which will be on the test.
To find out how you can attend SFNSF or to see the upcoming schedule of readings, go to sfnsf.org. Or you can follow the event on Twitter at SFNSF Events and on Meetup under SFNSF Events. For more information on upcoming events, go to sfnsf.org.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Now comes a really fun part of the evening, the Q&A, where you skewer the authors with questions they never heard of, but magically come up with answers for anyways.
We are paid to invent things, so.
Yes. That's why it works so well. Just a couple other things I wanted to call to your attention. Since this is an audience that is kind of in the swim of things, just to remind everyone, if you're interested, at the end of June, a very singular event happens up in Seattle, and it is the Locus Annual Awards. And it is a trip. There's airfare and hotel and all involved. But at the end of it, there are people like Connie Willis and Paul Park and James Patrick Kelly, and a chance to really mingle kind of on a one-on-one with some of your favorite authors, do workshops, wear a Hawaiian shirt, you get your own lei around your neck. But it's a really, really special weekend, and it tops it off with the announcement and the awarding of the Locus Awards. And you can find more information about that on their website at Locus Online, or you can email them at, well, I call them the Locus Luminaries, but they have a general email box that is locus@locusmag.com. So if you're interested at all, or you can follow along because I believe they also live stream or podcast the awards, so you can find out who won. I know, for instance, that our sponsor, Tachyon Publications, has a book up. Alistair Reynolds' Slow Bullets is up for an award, so we're very excited about that. And we hope it wins, of course. But, you know, congratulations to all the other nominees as well. So I, at this point, am going to go clean up the bar. Thank you all for your generosity there, by the way, as all the door and the bar take and the tips benefit the American Bookbinders Museum. And I'm going to let Terry Bisson take it away.
That'll do.
One other thing, while you have questions, please stand up. Marin will bring the mic to you, and that means your question will be recorded for the podcast and not lost to posterity. Here we go. Thank you.
Don't let that scare you out of asking questions.
Cliff.
So both of your readings had displaced persons as protagonists and narrators, but they're not, just like your typical stand-in for the reader kind of displaced person, like you might get in Narnia or something like that. But they're like very strange people, like one and the amnesiac, who, although as a trope, is pretty much outside the lived experience of 99% of your readers. And you have someone who is coming back to Earth as a stranger in a strange land, right? Someone who is looking at a funhouse mirror version of our Earth from the point of view of someone who's been like an exile on a foreign planet for 20 years. So I was wondering if what drove your choice to have narrators as, displaced people who were not displaced from where the reader is, and how that one extra level of remove complicates and allows you to do things that you couldn't do in other ways.
I can grab that one, sure. Anything I say about this book, which I finished a couple of years ago, there's going to be a revisionist aspect to it. I'm going to make up a narrative and pretend that it's true. So I can think of... I won't know there's going to be at least a grain of truth in both of these explanations. One, I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs, not unlike Dylan Green years. He's not me. In fact, he's based on someone other than me. But inevitably, you identify with the character for a while. There's some interpenetration, no pun intended. But since college, I've been living in, a luxurious kind of exile. I was in Japan for a while, and I've been in Honolulu for 10 years. It's politically the United States, but it feels real different. And I kind of like it. I kind of like having one foot in and one foot out. One of my heroes is James Joyce, who talked about silence, exile, and cunning, right? He left Ireland and never really went back except once to open the first movie theater in that country, and it flopped somehow. But I think the exile thing suits me because I always felt that way. You know, probably all of us who are science fiction fans felt a little odd and have vexed relationships with our hometowns. So the exile thing is nothing new. It's just I've made it a little more obvious in recent years. That's part of my answer. The other thing is that one of the themes throughout this book is themes, or it's a motif, and it's working both at the level of form and content. Is you heard me use the word defamiliarization, and I'm trying to do that in this book deliberately all over the place. The idea comes from a Russian formalist critic, 1918, I think. Viktor Shklovsky wrote an article, an essay called "Art as Device," and he gives us the term "ostranenie," which literally is translated as "strange making." That gives its name to part 2 of this book, Strange Maker. It usually is translated as defamiliarization. And when he writes about it, he writes about how habitualization is the enemy. Habit makes us forget how horrible war is, how much we love our wives, how beautiful, a flower is. And art, he says, exists that we may, how does he put it? Recover the sense of life. And Paul Park in his blurb kind of picked up on that aspect of the book, and I'm glad, because that was really quite intentional. I mean for this to be a resensitizing book somehow. I think that that's connected somehow with the exile idea. And it's called cognitive estrangement. Darko Suvin, the science fiction critic, called it that. And we're talking about a kind of physical estrangement in exile, I guess. How's that?
Can you beat that?
Well, I'm sitting here thinking, you're bringing up your literary theorists, and I'm about to talk about role-playing games, so I'll be bringing it back down here. The deep, dark secret with these novellas that I'm going to be writing, and by secret I mean thing I have posted publicly on my blog, is that Ree, the protagonist of these novellas, is me reworking a game that I played in a live-action role-playing game, or a character that I played in a live-action role-playing game for about 4 years. So why she is in the state that she's in is because when I decided that there was kind of a core idea at the center of that character that I wanted to rework, I needed to figure out what were the things about the character that needed to remain true in order for that idea to make sense. And one of them was that she had to live multiple lifetimes, because the game in question was Changeling the Dreaming, for anybody who knows it, where it's fairy souls incarnating into mortal hosts, and in any given lifetime, you don't remember the previous lifetimes that you had unless stuff happens to cause you to start to remember it. So in this thing, Rhea is not being born into some human body, she is just herself a supernatural creature. But it is true that every time, like, her lifetimes are basically when a human summons her out of this realm and then banishes her, banish meaning kill, to send her back where she came from. So I needed it to be something where she didn't remember her past lives initially, and that's one of the things that I had to keep for the story to work. So for me, the whole thing of her being estranged from her surroundings in that fashion is because that was a necessary component of what I wanted to do with the overarching story of these novellas, and I'm hoping to do a standalone novel, well, standalone, following on the novellas, but just a single novel, would involve her slowly regaining the memories of what happened to her in previous lifetimes and figuring out what went wrong with them. So for me, it really was a pragmatic thing of why have I set this up. Now, I will admit that kind of from the anthropological and world-building side, it is very helpful to have a point of view character who is in some fashion not familiar with what they're encountering, because it gives you a good reason to explain things to the reader. And I also like the contrast that you get between what the point of view character expects and what they run into, because you can build all kinds of interesting dynamics of tension out of that. But in this case, it really was because I'm reworking a role-playing game. So not a very highfalutin answer, I fear.
But also you have a whole body of work that to me is unique in fantasy because your background, you have a background in science, in anthropology or archaeology.
Thank you for calling those sciences. Not everybody agrees.
Well,
yeah.
But it seems to, you used the term one time of hard fantasy,
yeah.
where the fantasy is not just somebody who walks into a closet and they're in another world, but it's more of putting some kind of rigor into the world.
Yeah.
And I don't think we get a whole lot of that in the part that you read.
No, but it does build up over time.
But that seems to be like a lot of what you do.
Yeah. To recap it briefly, at one point I saw people using the term hard fantasy online. It was one of those just zeitgeist things where I saw it in 3 or 4 places at once, but nobody agreed on what they meant by it. And I figured out that for me, what defines hard science fiction is that it is concerned with how stuff works and why. And so for me then, the fantasy equivalent of that, you're still asking how stuff works and why, but instead of it being the physics or the biology or whatever, it's the world building, it's the cultures that people are interacting with in the story. So yes, when she's on this island, it is very much not hard fantasy because she's in a place where the normal laws of reality are suspended because of the nature of that place. But that is, you don't see this so much in this story, but in the broader context of the world, that's kind of an eruption of the fantastic into the normal world. And the place where people live most of the time is much more a anthropologically rigorous kind of thing of they need to get their food somewhere, the sun rises and sets like it's supposed to. And for that, I am having fun. I'm working on the second novella right now. So I've been doing a bunch of research on the kingdom of Dahomey, which existed in West Africa for a couple of centuries, just because I'd heard some things about it that sounded interesting, and I thought, all right, let's use that as my inspiration here. So reading up on how they made things work and trying to, use that as my springboard.
Yeah. Please.
So I've got a question about the space traveler who has a copy of himself murdered at the other end of the travel.
Sure.
Do you really believe that personal identity is just an information pattern that we can copy and one would experience a continuity of personal identity through such an experience?
Wow, you're really asking me that one.
They did promise kind of brain-breaking questions here.
Yes.
So.
Gosh, on the airplane yesterday, I was reading David Deutsch's last book on physics, and he talks about, he really believes in the multiverse, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics and superpositions. And he talks about the idea of fungibility. So there could be another you, identical in every respect, but there would be certain aspects, at what level, I'm not sure, atomic, molecular, where little bits can be fungible and your histories are going to play out differently. I think I'm not a dualist. I'm not Cartesian. I don't think there's any special sauce to my personhood. I think if we were to clone me right now in every respect, including my microbiota and my belt, it would have to be, by definition, standing over here, and from the very first moment, his experience would diverge from mine. If somehow it could occupy the same position without exploding, yeah, I think we'd probably be the very same thing. I also think it's entirely theoretical. I don't think it's going to come up anytime soon. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to think about, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it also seems to me like in this book, in particular, you're more interested in diverging from, in exploring every idea that flinted across your mind and figuring out a way to work it into this book rather than having a rigorous scientific thesis that you're following out.
I think of the science in this book, or in science fiction generally, that is my own science fiction. I think of the science as being a generative constraint. The same way, the modernists had all their schools, right, and they would make rules. The imagists went in fear of abstractions. Surrealists went in fear of the rational. Oulipo in 1960, they're the most famous of the constraint builders. This is a French group of mathematicians and writers. Georges Perec and who's the other guy? Raymond Queneau are the most famous of them. But Perec very famously wrote a novel called La Disparition, Disappearance. In French, that word has no E in it, disparition, and neither does the whole novel. He removed or avoided the most common letter in that alphabet, in that language, from a 300-page novel. It was subsequently translated, by the way, into English as avoid by some maniac who managed to do it without ever using the letter E. No the, no he, no she. So that constraint, the Oulipo artists would say, isn't a constraint. they build prisons for themselves in order to be free. And I think the science for me is kind of like that. It's, who was it? Robert Frost hated free verse. He said it was like playing tennis without a net. Well, who wants to play tennis without a net? That's no fun. So physics is a net. But then once in a while, if you're going to make a science fiction story that's at all exciting, you're going to have to fudge it a little bit, right? Most famously, this is the speed of light being a problem, right? So we've got a warp drive, or somehow we're doing FTL travel, faster than light travel.
What do you use there?
I've made some stuff up. So
I know that. What did you call it?
I read a bit about quantum entanglement, and the guy who figures it out is a 12-year-old wonderkin from Japan, Jun Watanabe, and he figures out some principles of entanglement that enable him to more or less steer the quantum universe. And it fits with sort of the grander themes of this book. The first word in the book is young, and there's a romantic aspect to this book. The idea that children are somehow natural geniuses. So I also have the Higgs boson is discovered in the 90s by a little kid in Boise, Idaho, with his home atom smashing kit.
Back in Idaho.
That's right. I think it's Idaho. Yeah, right. So I use real science where it exists, and then I just make stuff up.
You just have a slightly differently shaped net, is all, when you're playing science game.
Quite right. Yeah.
Three-dimensional, four-dimensional.
Maybe dips down a little in the middle, up at the ends. Yeah.
Well, what was the thing Ursula Le Guin uses for?
The Ansible.
Yeah, which was totally about the quantum entanglement thing.
Right.
She was who was never thought of as a hard science fiction writer, but she was the first actually to use that, which is a real thing.
There's a nod to that in this book when the protagonist is having a hearing test and he's being asked to repeat some words. He gets something like baseball, hot dog, Ansible. So it's a little nod to Ursula there.
Explain it.
Well, I just mean, it's so if I'm checking your hearing, I'll pronounce some words without you being able to see. The third one is Ansible. Yeah. Just a nod, just a little tribute.
Okay. Next question. Please.
Tom, how did you come up with the ideas for this book? And then the second question is that why did you choose science fiction as your writing genre?
It's probably the same answer, and I've heard other writers talk about discovering a process as if it's something that's going to work every time. For me, it's completely different every time. With this one, honestly, it came in a kind of flash in the shower. I saw the whole book. I saw the structure in the course of one 5-minute shower. I wrote a draft very quickly, 1 month quick, 50,000 words in a month, and then I spent 3 years cleaning it up. Why science fiction? I don't know. It was the premise from the very beginning. And I guess I've been reading, that's what I was reading, I'm not exclusively a science fiction writer, nor do I intend to be, but I do love science fiction, and that's the mode that I was in. I don't know how else to answer that. Sort of irreducible.
During the break, we were talking about how I think they actually do put something in shower water, because just things are so much clearer when you get in the shower. And you're like, oh, that's how. Okay.
I think it's my showers are usually in the morning, and I'm not quite awake yet. The part of me that hates myself hasn't woken up yet.
Fair.
These showers, I should try taking one sometime. I've never tried that. Sounds interesting. Well, I like the constraint of the idea, but I think constraint is what art is made out of. Art is made out of frames and constraints. So I'm not sure that's particular to science fiction.
Oh, no, I agree. You got to choose your constraint. I think in science fiction, it's physics.
Yeah, your constraints seem rather elastic in King of the World.
Granted.
Or what you might call guidelines than actual rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
Such a useful quote.
So are your books Lady Trent? She's an anthropologist?
No, she's a natural historian. She's basically a field biologist.
Okay.
I sort of deliberately didn't make her an anthropologist because I thought I wanted her to be coming at it from a different angle than that. There is a character I introduced later in the series who's an archaeologist, and that's, if anybody in the series is an authorial self-insert, it's that one, not the protagonist. But no, I decided, I mean, the inspiration of the series basically, and now I'm going to drag things back to role-playing games again, came from coming up with an idea, thinking, well, what if I ran a Dungeons & Dragons game where instead of killing the dragons and taking their stuff, you were there to study them and learn things about them? And I figured out pretty fast that trying to run that with the systems for Dungeons & Dragons would be pretty thankless, but that I could write some fun novels out of it. Oh. So yeah, it started very much with the, because the dragons are natural animals, so you kind of can't study them anthropologically, right? Because they don't have a culture of their own. You know, you can study the culture of how humans interact with them, and that's a thing that crops up again and again in the series, is that she goes there to study the dragons, but it's impossible to do that without looking at the human-dragon ecology and how those things interface. So the anthropology comes through anyway, it's just not her focus, it's mine. Slightly different thing.
And both of yours are the two that I know about, although I never read Big in Japan. But they seem to be about entertainers who are not doing too well.
That's true, huh? Gee whiz! Who knew? Yeah. I mean, yes. I can relate to them, absolutely.
Yeah, I've got a novel that's not yet published, which is about, it's a playwright instead of a novelist, but you know, it's about his struggles and such. I think everybody does that at some point.
Do you have a background in entertaining?
Just this. Actually, I take that back. I was in a garage band in high school with that guy over there, whom I haven't seen since. It's been exactly 20 years, in fact. Who knew? It was kind of metafictional thing happening in the room. Yeah, I played music for years. Played guitar. And I was the youngest of four and always, entertaining.
Were you big in Japan?
No. In fact, no band is. They just like to tell themselves they are. Yeah.
When we were talking earlier, it's an expression I've heard in science fiction, like Rudy Rucker or somebody will say, well, at a certain point, I understand I'm big in Japan, and just because you've been there.
Sure.
Or, you've been published there. What were you doing in Japan?
Well, the first time I was really interested in Buddhism. I had an English teacher in high school at a Catholic school who was sort of a bodhisattva that turned me on to Buddhism. And so when I was a junior in college, I went for the summer. I got to go real cheap to Tokyo for a month and study Buddhism at a place called Sophia University. I went back the next summer, and then out of college, I had a Fulbright fellowship to try to write a novel. And I was sort of cocky and young, and I thought I was going to go bang out a novel in a year, and that was a hard year. I had another thing coming.
Where were you in Japan?
That year I was in Kyoto, and the following year I lived in Yokohama. Yeah.
I've been there a couple of times, so.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, I've been to Japan 3 times at this point.
Doing what?
First time was I got a really cheap plane ticket my senior spring break, and my sister actually was living in Gifu at the time, so I went to visit her and sightsee. This was the spring of 2002, so when ticket prices were still below rock bottom because of 9/11. I flew from New York to Tokyo round trip for $342.
Wow.
Thought, I'm going to Japan this year because I will never be able to do this again. And I have been able to. Went on a trip just for the fun of it, then a few years later, or nearly a decade later, to Kyoto and Nagasaki and Fukuoka. And then my husband and I were able to go to Okinawa for a karate seminar recently, which was a lot of fun.
What do you think of Murakami?
Have not actually read his stuff.
I run into him in Honolulu. I think I shouldn't say this on a podcast, but I think he spends a good bit of time there. Yeah, and he runs. And I run the marathon there every year. This year was the first exception in 8 years. Yeah, and I talked to him about his writing, and he didn't. I think he didn't like that I recognized him. I think he's there to be incognito. Yeah.
Like, I come here to get away from that kind of thing.
Yes. I've read virtually everything he's written, and I really like about half of it.
Yeah. I think I'll take it back. I do believe I read, I don't remember now what it was, but some, not full novel thing of his in a class that I loathed in graduate school, which it was a class that was supposed to be on Japanese science fiction and fantasy, only the woman teaching it her idea of fantasy was, and I don't even know how broadly this term is used outside of her class, but psychodrama, where it's like, it's kind of more in the surrealist, well, you're never really sure, is the magic real or is it just somebody being, mentally disturbed? And I'm like, that's my least favorite mode of fantasy ever. I want the genre to feel like it is actually genre rather than just sort of coyly winking in its direction. And the teacher was also really an abysmally bad teacher. She treated her college students like high school students and her grad students like college students, so I did not have a lot of patience with that class, and it may have soured me slightly against the things I read in it.
Hi, I'm Grania Davis, and I've lived in Honolulu. I'd love to talk to you about that. I'm bi-coastal, and also in Japan near Tokyo, and I worked on a book of science. Were you at the Yokohama Convention in 2007?
No, I lived there.
Okay, well,
back
the
in
WorldCon. We did a book of Japanese science fiction in translation.
Is it the one called Monkey Brain Sushi?
No, Speculative Japan.
Oh, I've read that one too.
Okay, you know that. Okay, I'm the co-editor. Okay, so the thing about Japanese science fiction, okay, there is some hard science fiction, as we would call it, but even set in other planets, there are, okay, science fiction can be character-driven, plot-driven, action-driven. Japanese science fiction tends to be mood-driven. Like Emily Bronte is mood-driven. So that's
almost gothic, atmospheric.
Atmospheric, exactly. And by the way, Ursula Le Guin is a perfect example of hard fantasy.
Yes, and actually she's one of the people who inspired me, so yeah. She unsurprisingly has a lot of familiarity with anthropology and such, so she thinks about it from a similar angle.
Well, she's from a famous family of
yes, exactly.
anthropologists.
Yeah, her father, very well-known anthropologist.
Yeah.
Most like film and stuff in Japan is also mood-driven. The ones that aren't do better in the U.S. and abroad, and also Cheap Tricks and The Runaways were huge in Japan.
Oh. Frozen is legitimately huge in Japan.
Yes, oh my, when I was in Okinawa, I could not go anywhere without hearing Let It Go being sung in one language or another, including the final dinner, farewell dinner for this karate seminar. The traditional Okinawan performers who had been hired to play for this thing, they did a lot of traditional Okinawan music and also Let It Go and La Bamba. So we got some culture whiplash that night. La Bamba was their tribute to the Spanish contingent that was there for the seminar. It was a little mind melty.
I've got a question about the natural historical study of dragons in two parts. What is the most difficult thing about placing yourself in a fantasy setting and doing, natural history from that point of view? And number two, what would you most like to know about the physiology of dragons personally?
All right, well, for the first part of it, I'm able to dodge, I think, some of the potential difficulty there because I'm trying to make the biology and everything else about that world as real as I can manage within my constraints. I don't have to make up a lot of stuff about the biology, I just need to research things. Now, there certainly are things that I've thought about which never make it into the text, like one of the things I think is probably true about Isabella's world is the oxygen content of the atmosphere is higher, but there's no way I can get that into the story because there's no reason for her to ever say, and the oxygen percentage in our atmosphere was blah, 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 blah. And even if she said that, most readers aren't going to know is that higher or lower than our own world. Like, off the top of my head, I don't remember the oxygen percentage of our atmosphere.
20, 18?
Something in that
20.
ballpark. But anyway, it was something where I did a fair amount of research into dinosaurs because they make, kind of a useful analogy in certain ways. And there's certain things about my dragon biology that I took from dinosaurs. And one of the things I read talked about how during the Great Age of pterosaurs, who I should note are not dinosaurs because I had a 6-year-old girl point that out to me. So I will never forget. 6-year-old child tells you you've got this wrong. But that part of the reason they were able to fly probably had to do with the oxygen content of the atmosphere at the time. So I find myself reading up on things like that, and I would say the most difficult part is just trying to make sure that what I say doesn't sound laughably wrong, because I'm not a biologist, I'm an anthropologist. Now, the part of it, there are certainly some hand-wavy things that go into my dragon biology. The big MacGuffin of the series is that dragon bone is this kind of like wondrous substance that one of the driving things in the series is that people figure out how to preserve it and then are trying to figure out how to synthesize it because it's amazingly light and strong and, you know, it's the unobtainium of the story. But if there's one thing that I would want to know, is there any way that you could actually make something like a dragon that could really fly in our world? Because that would be awesome.
If they metabolize oxygen and nitrogen differently, that could explain how they could...
It's mostly the physics. Yeah, it's the physics of the lift, basically, is where you go wrong. I do have something in there about their lungs are built more like those of birds, because when you think about the way that we breathe, we take in the air and expel the air through the same channel, and birds actually have a different system where the air goes out a different way than it comes in, and because of how this is built, it's much more efficient. So I'm like, they have bird lungs. That still doesn't actually answer how they make the physics of the flapping go, but at least I could say they're making better use of their respiration. Okay, so that's kind of the level of hand-wavy that I get to. I point to some things that are real. Yeah. But I would love it if we could engineer something like that could actually fly, because tell me that wouldn't be cool.
Well, how would oxygen, I mean, so you're saying the air is thicker?
Yeah, I honestly, it was years ago that I was looking at the thing about oxygen content of the atmosphere, so I've forgotten a lot of the details now. But
I once thought about doing a story, I never did it, but about, well, the oxygen content's about 19 or 20%, I think. And I was thinking if the oxygen content was 11 or 12, we would still have many of the animals we have, and we would still have many of the, you know, it wouldn't change that much, except you wouldn't have fire. You might not have fire. So you would have hominids, but without fire. And then what would you...
Anthropologist's brain goes, oh, that changes things. Yeah, because, I mean, fire, like, in addition to being useful for keeping us warm and keeping away predators, it also helps with us being able to get more energy out of our food, because when you cook stuff, you can break it down and make it easier for us to metabolize. So, yeah.
So anyway...
getting rid of fire, that would make life very different.
Terry has very famously written a story in which bears discover fire. Yeah?
Yeah, but that's, that has nothing to do with the oxygen.
There's, oh, I'm trying to remember what book it is. My brain's trying to assign this to Diana Wynne Jones, but I don't think it's true. Somebody has a story with a cat who is polydactyl, meaning that, you know, they got extra toes, and often polydactyl cats are able to kind of pick things up because of the way their paws are built. Somebody's got a story where there's a cat who's able to pick things up and turns out to be a pyromaniac, which is slightly hazardous, but I don't remember who that is now. It's gonna drive me mad, especially because I don't think Googling pyromaniac cat would actually get me anywhere to the story.
No, it'd get you on the NSA list. Probably.
No, I'm already on that list. I had a short story published in an anthology that was deliberately put together as a political protest against a very badly written law in Britain that was going to make it illegal to glorify terrorism. So the anthology is called Glorifying Terrorism, and I have a story in it. So if I'm on a watch list, that's why.
Well, now, when you were at, you went to Harvard, right?
Yes.
And you were the head of the, or co-head of the science fiction club between Harvard and...
Yes, the Harvard-Radcliffe Science Fiction Association, or HRSFA.
What was that like?
It was a lot of fun. I mean,
were you new to being a science fiction fan then? Or
no, I mean, I'd been reading that kind of thing for a while. You know, I certainly, when I was looking through the list of undergraduate organizations, that was one that caught my eye. I will say that it was a really great group to be a part of, because they're just like really enthusiastic, and I forget, the club is now several decades old, so it's been going strong. And actually, while I was there, we ended up starting up a convention at Harvard called Vericon that I was the guest coordinator for 2 years, and then I was just attending to hang out with friends for 2 years, and then I was on the program. Like, I'm on the opposite side of my old job now. But yeah, Vericon's been going for more than a decade at this point, so it was really nice to contribute to getting that started.
Now, what started you writing when you were when you were reading when you were a kid, or what?
Writing in the very beginning. Yeah, I've always been writing. I wasn't a serious reader until sort of late.
You wrote before you read?
Yeah, it was right. It's actually a problem in American culture at large now. I've had so many students who are really interested in writing and not particularly interested in reading.
Well, I've heard that from other people.
Yeah, it's a problem. Yeah, but I was truly always writing. I went to a Catholic school. We had creative writing class in fifth grade. I just shared it. We did fifth grade and sixth grade. I got these books and I write horror stories. And mostly I was watching Nightmare on Elm Street and movies like that at the time. And so in story after story, somebody's getting slashed and I'm drawing pools of blood on the ground. And my nun teachers are writing at the bottom, "Nice job." One of them, you open a door and there's like a corpse and all this blood, and she wrote, "I like your door."
Now, I taught creative writing to some 12 and 13-year-olds a couple of summers ago, and at the end of the course, when the parents came to pick their kids up, I had to have a little conference with each set of parents. And one of the girls had been writing this like horror story with, I think it was like a post-zombie apocalypse. So the parents come in and one of them's like, "So our daughter keeps writing all these really like dark and horrific stories. Should we be worried?" I'm like, "Your daughter's 12. Do you know how normal that is for that age?" Like, writing stories where people die hideously is kind of what you do when you're that age. It is completely normal. In fact, in some ways, yeah. In some ways, I would almost be more worried about the kid who doesn't come up with those ideas at that age.
I have a 9-year-old daughter who published her first book when she turned 8. She started it at 6, which means she spent 25% of her young life on this book.
That's impressive.
With some help from her dad. Yeah. It's kind of a fantasy story. Travis and the Golden Crystal. You'll find it in the iBook store. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for putting it on the agenda.
Absolutely.
Thank God what I was writing at that age isn't out in public.
I mean, my question was, at what point you read something and you think, "I'd like to try to do this"?
Yeah, that was high school for me. And it really, probably the reason I'm a teacher now is because some teachers in high school changed my life. One in particular, Michael Koenig, sophomore year English. I grew up in a sort of blue-collar house with not a whole lot of books in it. And so I wasn't necessarily ready to read Shakespeare. So when he assigned Julius Caesar and a report on Julius Caesar, I wasn't doing that sophomore year in high school. So I wrote a little report on the boxer Julio Cesar Chavez. And I made that up too. I didn't know anything about him, except that there was such a guy. So it was an exercise in fiction writing. And he gave me an A. And he sort of like reinforced my creativity. We were learning vocabulary words, and I would just make stuff up. When my lips are chapped, I use Vacillate intensive care. Last night, my brother and I went to see the Dubious Brothers. A. And so I just ran with it. And I'm still
You still do the same shit, yeah.
Yeah, and there's an irreverent young Turk streak in me, and it comes from that. Yeah.
For me, it was very distinctly, I was either 9 or 10, I don't remember, Diana Wynne Jones' book, Fire and Hemlock. That was the one that I remember putting it down and thinking, I want to be a writer. Because the characters in it are telling a story together. They keep sending these, because it's set far enough back in the past that they're sending these giant packets of letters through the mail and telling just a very kind of conventional fantasy story in many ways, but the story that it's taking place in is an adaptation of Tamlin and Thomas the Rhymer and so forth. So I really loved it for that. But the fact that they're telling this story together, I thought, I want to do that. And it wasn't that I hadn't made up stories before, because a lot of kids do. But that was the first time that I thought about wanting to tell a story for somebody else to read, thinking about having an audience.
Yeah.
This teacher that I mentioned wrote on every one of my papers, the longer papers, you need to go, you're insane, you need to go talk to a counselor. And at the end of the semester, we had written our longest story, maybe a 10-page short story. And mine was weirdly kind of playful, actually, metafictional sort of. And he wrote on the bottom, "Go to the counseling center. Just kidding. Since this is the last chance I have to tell you so, you could be a great writer someday." And there was no one in my life telling me that kind of thing.
That's pretty sweet.
Changed me. It did. And that's sort of the trail I followed. And when my first book came out many years later, I thanked him in the acknowledgments. And we had lunch when I was home. And He had no memory of that, any of that. It meant so much more to me than it did to him, but it was enough.
Now, here's the question. Would it have still had that impact if he hadn't played with you all semester long saying you need to go seek counseling?
I think it might have.
Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Well, it's just a question that they ask a lot of people, but who are writers, and I think, or even who aren't, I remember for me it was like, again, 10 or 12, and I read Simax City.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I thought, God, I'd love to be, how do you do that? Yeah. That's just, and then a lot of other stuff happens, but there's one thing that kind of sticks in your mind.
If it's a writer, for me it would be Vonnegut. I discovered Vonnegut, and it's like so many high school kids do at around 17. Yeah. I read it all.
Well, when you're 17 or 18, Vonnegut is fucking Shakespeare.
That's right.
That's kind of the perfect age for him, I think.
Yeah.
That's for sure. All right, I'm going to take two more questions, one intelligent and one stupid. The intelligent first.
So this is for Marie. So before I read the first Lady Trent book, I assumed that the series was going to be set on Earth. Mm. And it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, during your world building, was it ever intended to be on Earth, or not?
It wasn't ever intended to be on Earth, so for anybody who's not familiar with it, it's set in a world that is very clearly analogous to Earth, specifically in the 19th century. There's a lot of parallels between the places that she goes and real regions of the Earth. And I don't recall making a conscious decision that I was going to set it slightly askew, but I think subconsciously what was going on was I knew I wanted a greater degree of freedom, because the series I've been doing immediately beforehand, The Onyx Cord, they're historical fantasies that are set in London at different points in its history, and I have not entirely jokingly called those my home PhD in English history. I did stacks of research for them. And they're secret history. So that was a lot of fun of doing things where I say, okay, without changing what really happened, how can I fit all this other stuff into the cracks? And that was great. But I knew at the end of doing 4 books of that I was tired of it and needed a change of pace. So, at the same time, I was reading Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, and one of the things that I saw certain kinds of readers complaining about, for them, they couldn't let go of the fact that if humanity had been harnessing dragons for war purposes since Roman times, you would have had history diverging much more than it did. You would not have England and France fighting basically the same Napoleonic wars, but with dragons, if the history had diverged that far back in the past. That doesn't bother me personally as a reader, but I knew it bothered some people. So I thought, I knew that there were things that I wanted to do differently with the history, and it was just way easier for my own brain to say, rather than trying to justify why our world is different, I'm just going to kind of take our world, port it over here, and start changing things. Because, one thing I've got is a sort of Atlantean-type civilization, the Draconians who worship dragons, etc. They were kind of this global world-spanning thing, and I didn't want to have to justify that in the real world. I wanted to just say, look, there was this civilization, go with it, and to change things about exactly how colonial history plays out and so forth. So yes, it was basically just wanting to have the freedom to kind of tweak things a little bit, to have the areas be inspired by a particular location without me being bound to every single historical detail about that place. And it means things like the tech level. People have asked me, what exactly, where are we in real world history? And I'm like, it's somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. I don't have to pick a year and say it's exactly then. If you didn't have this tech then, you don't have it in this story. I can fudge. So it was a lot easier for me to do it that way, basically.
In the back. This could be intelligent also. We'll put the stupid one on.
But you wanted something not intelligent.
No, I'll do the stupid one. You do the intelligent.
Well, but my question was for. I'll ask the question, which is frivolous. If you had a superpower, which would it be, and why?
You want to take that one first?
No.
All right, I will go first then. Flight. I don't care that it's not the most useful thing I could choose. I want to be able to fly, which I think more than anything I may attribute to reading Ender's Game at an impressionable age. I honestly am tempted to, if I weren't in the middle of buying a house, save up the money to get a ride on the Vomit Comet, which is the plane that they drop. They use it for filming zero gravity stuff sometimes before they came up with the wire rigs that allow them to fake it. Yeah. It's apparently only about $5,000 to go on a ride on that, which is a chunk of money, but it's within the realm of like, no, you could actually save up for that maybe and do it, because I want to be weightless. I want to go zooming around in the air and doing somersaults and everything, and if I could fly over the planet, I would. And yeah, I don't care if there are other more useful powers I could choose, like teleportation. I want to fly.
Stay low to the ground or you're going to have oxygen problems.
Yeah, the last book of the memoirs is taking place in the Himalaya equivalent. I am up on the oxygen problem. I'm very familiar.
Right.
Yeah.
I hate, this is so boring, but I too would choose flight for different reasons. As is very clear, I'm romantic at heart, and I remember watching those Superman movies from the 80s and seeing Superman zip around with Lois Lane, and I think that's a really cool date.
It's cheap too.
Cheap too. Yeah, doesn't even cost $5,000.
I also have a recurring dream. There's just one that, well, actually, to take that back, I have two recurring dreams. One, I'm in a boxing ring, and I'm just getting pummeled, and my arms are like lead. I can't move them, so I just have to get pummeled, and that's how that dream ends. And the other one is similar. I'm in my driveway where I grew up, and I'm running, and I can fly, but I can only get, it's sort of like a long jump. You know how you run in the air? I'm doing that, and I'm just 2 feet above the ground, and I'm pretty good. Like, I can go for long enough that it's, you know I'm defying gravity. It's enough for me to, like, want people to watch. But then I try to go higher, and that's it. I can't. I fall every time. And so if I could actually take off, that would be totally thrilling, and I'd, of course, pick up my wife, and we'd go on a date.
Just a quick comment. If you study lucid dreaming, you can fly. I've had lucid dreams, and I've always, when you realize you're dreaming and you can do whatever the heck you want, I've always flown, and it's great.
I want to be able to do it in actual flesh, though.
Yeah.
Well, my superpower, I'd like to be a superdelegate at the Democratic Convention. So, thank you all for coming. Thank these guys for a great read. Who's this woman?
Remember me? The barkeep. Thank you all again for coming tonight. If you have any books to be signed, the authors will be more than delighted to do that because it means you bought them. Yay! And a big thanks again to everybody that makes this possible. Tachyon Publications, SF and SF, a savior at times because he pays for all the liquor, which is great because you guys get to enjoy it. SomaFM for our podcast, which reminds me, our last event with Peter S. Beagle and Carter Schultz is now up and running at SomaFM. I suggest you check it out. It's really fun. And then this one will be ready in about a week or so. And I'll send out an email, or you can stay tuned to the radio station waiting for it to come by, and you can hear this all over again. So, again, a big thanks to Terry Bisson, M. Thomas Gammarino, and Marie Brennan, and y'all. Thank you again. Good night.
You've been listening to the May 2016 SF recorded live at the American Bookbinders Museum in San Francisco. This podcast was produced by Mary McDonald and engineered by Rusty Hodge. SomaFM is listener-supported commercial-free radio broadcasting from San Francisco to the world with over 30 channels of hand-picked music from SomaFM's award-winning music directors. Get the SomaFM app for your mobile device or tune in at somafm.com. Thanks for listening. So.